and welcome to another video. So this is my first month doing a monthly wrap-up instead of a seasonal wrap-up, and so I'm here with my June wrap-up. So for the most part, these are all things that were on my June TBR videos, so they're not like super different. It's just kind of me coming back at the end of the month and checking in on what I did get to, what I might not have gotten to, etc. So to start off, I'll just start with the first book that I finished in the month of June, and this is actually a carryover from my May TBR, and it was Chain of Gold by Cassandra Clare. This is the first book in the Last Hours series, which I believe is set to be a trilogy, and it's the fourth of a 5-book series in the Shadowhunter universe, 3 of which are already completed. So she's starting a new series with Chain of Gold, and then there's going to be one more before we say goodbye to the Shadowhunters universe, and I'll be very sad. So Chain of Gold takes place after the Infernal Devices and follows the children of some of the main characters in the Infernal Devices, and so I'm not going to go too into depth on who they are and whatnot in case you haven't read the Infernal Devices yet, but it's right after that. It takes place before the Mortal Instruments, and overall I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And honestly, I had a really hard time getting into this book, and it might not be completely the book's fault. I was planning to move, I was running a daily video series, I was just keeping up with worldly events and all the things that were going on in the month of June, and so I was not as invested in my reading as I have been in the past. That being said, there were the occasional book and the occasional time that sucked me in anyway, and that's what I really look for in like my 5-star books. So Chain of Gold didn't really get there for me. I found the plot at the beginning and some of the characters to be really slow, and even though we learn things later in the books that justify some of the things that frustrated me early in the book, we learned them so late that I spent a long chunk of the book being really frustrated by some premises that I didn't think were great. Like, they seemed really boring, and there was a conflict or two that I thought just didn't need to be a conflict. Like, it didn't make sense to me that the characters were so absorbed into these things, and at the same time it's kind of justified because there is the sense that at the beginning of this book, like, these are the children of the Infernal Devices, and the Infernal Devices contains this big epic conflict and war and stuff, and then right after is this. So there's this moment of peace in the Shadowhunters world, so the problems that these characters start off dealing with aren't the hugest. You know, they're like not relative to what you might expect going into a Shadowhunters book. So there's that give and take. Like, it makes sense that there would be slightly less going on and the problems would seem smaller, but that made it harder to get into. And then I did really like a lot of the characters, especially for the first half. I like Lucy. She's my favorite character. And I'm very interested in the character Alistair. That's like it. So it was interesting. As the story goes on, I really started to like Cordelia. And yeah, that's about where it goes. Those are the characters that I like right now. But things picked up. So you learn some stuff, and the end of the book I found really engaging. I mean, it was the climax, so like stuff was happening in the arc of a story, you know, that's where most things happen, but it was good, and I'm very intrigued in where the story is going to go. So I feel like this book was very slow in that it was the first book of a new series and there is a lot of setup, but now I'm really excited for the payoff. So I can forgive it if the next 2 books are really good, but we'll see where it goes. So I gave it 3 out of 5 stars because there were chunks that I really loved, and then there was a good chunk where I was like meh. So it was just kind of in the middle of the scale for me on average. Then the second book that I finished in the month of June was White Rage by Carol Anderson, and this is a non-fiction book. And not only am I not a well-versed, super experienced book reviewer, but I am especially not well-versed in reviewing non-fiction books. So I'm not going to give it a rating here. I'm just going to kind of talk about it. So White Rage takes a look at the ways across history where you have particular events or periods of time that have been considered racially progressive. So things like the Civil War and Reconstruction and things like that. but then it displays and goes into details on how, yes, we know a lot of people know the surface level of these events, but they haven't actually done quite as much as people like to think they have, or as they are celebrated for doing, because you see with these events and these instances of Black progress, the aftermath in the form of white rage. And so, if I'm remembering it correctly, Carol Anderson defines white rage as being this effect of white people feeling threatened and uncertain and rageful and angry at Black progression. And so you have these events, you start with this era of progression, some legislation was passed or something like that, that should lead to greater equality, and then you see white rage come out, and you see the things that people, particularly the white people in leadership at the time, kind of did to undermine this progress, and the legislation that they were passed to actually make these benefits harder for people to get to, and just set them back anyway, even if supposedly there was progress made. And as you go throughout the book, like, that gets more and more underhanded, right? Racism is not something that is okay to be explicit about in most arenas, and so people get really subtle with it, and they pass laws that use broad terms and say they're going to affect broad people, but they're targeted predominantly at Black people. And so that's white rage. I really love the way it was organized, and I say that's white rage, but like, I did not cover or even touch on so much of the book. I read it as part of the Blackout Buddy Read hosted by Shay from Books with Shay, and she has a whole live show where they go through the book and how the topics of the book in particular affect the bookish community and booktube and things like that. So it was definitely an interesting live show. It is very long, so be ready for that. I tuned in for the beginning and I was there through the end, so I can tell you that it's like 2 hours, so be ready to sit and listen. But it was really good, and I really liked the way this book was organized in particular because it's chronological and it highlights these key moments in history that you're probably already familiar with, but it looks at them in a slightly different light, and I found it very enlightening. And it also doesn't just like throw this information at you. At the very end, the like epilogue-ish afterward section is called Imagine, and it's basically Carol Anderson's call to action. Like, yes, all these things have been happening, but you know what? Now that you know that they're there, look for them and then do something about them. And we say that the like great idealistic image of the United States does not exist, but just because it doesn't exist right now doesn't mean that it can't and that it shouldn't, and we should always work towards that, and that there are things that you can do. And then there are discussion questions and more resources. And something that I noticed that was pretty cool is if you're reading the ebook, you can actually click on the footnotes as hyperlinks, and then every time you go to a hyperlinked footnote, if that footnote and that source came from a website, that is also hyperlinked. So you can like click through things and really access a ton of extra resources within the ebook. They're there as a book, as a physical book as well, but you have to actually go through and like type things out and search things up. But yeah, so White Rage by Carol Anderson. The next book that I finished in the month of June is The Shadow Rising by Robert Jordan. This is the 4th book in the Wheel of Time series, and sometime in the month of July maybe, I will have a whole vlog video about it, so I won't go on for long because there's not much to say that won't give away things that happen in the first 3 books. So it just picks up from where the 3rd book left, and some pretty wild stuff happens. I liked it. I did give it 5 out of 5 stars, so I liked it a bit more than some of the others. It was very, very long, and I think because of that, there are parts that seem to drag more, but the payoff at the end for me was much greater in some of the story arcs, and so that's why it kind of pushed it up from 4 stars to 5 stars. And then the next book that I finished in the month of June was A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. And here I am rereading this book. It's actually probably the closest back-to-back reread of a book I've ever done. I read A Court of Thorns and Roses for the first time via audiobook in January, and I reread it via a physical book in June. So like 6 months. But that's because I read A Court of Thorns and Roses and A Court of Mist and Fury back to back, and then I never finished the series. I never read A Court of Wings and Ruin, and then I was so floored and so excited by A Court of Mist and Fury that I was like listening to the audiobook really quickly, and I know there are small details that I didn't pick up and didn't like put all together, and so I really wanted to reread the 2 first books before I finally read the last book to better synthesize everything that's going on, because there are some aspects of the story where I was super invested in, and then there were other aspects where I know I let detail slips, especially in some of the bigger overarching plot that like brings in pieces from the first book and then builds in the second book, and you get the main villain is really like, I don't think we even see him in the second book, but you get more details about him and what his plot is, and all those details are lost to me. So before they come to a head in the third book, I wanted to make sure to reread the first 2, and I started with The Court of Thorns and Roses in June. Maintained at 5 out of 5 stars. I just really liked it. I thought it was a really fun book. I'm really surprised by how short it is in physical copy, because the audiobook seemed to be really long. So that was surprising to me. But otherwise, I really enjoyed my reread, and I picked up details that I feel like I didn't in the first read through. Like when I was thinking about the book, I knew there was the character Amarantha, and then I was like, who is she? Like, I knew what she does, but like, where did she come from? I could not remember, and rereading the book, that was like a kind of detail that I picked up, and I'm glad to have with me going into the rest of the series. The final book that I finished in the month of June was White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. This is a book that basically, the subtitle is Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Race, I believe. And so it does exactly what it says it does. It talks about this concept of white fragility, which is all of the feelings and mechanisms and things that pop up in white people when confronted with the idea of race, and how people tend to think about racism as being outwardly malicious behavior. And so when you think about racism as being outwardly malicious behavior, and then you're called out on a racist act, then you can think about that as a moral judgment and jump to defend yourself as a good person. However, what Robin DiAngelo really pieces out throughout White Fragility is that racism is not just a moral judgment, it's a systematic way of the world, and you are raised up in that world, so you cannot not be affected by it, and it's going to affect your actions, and everybody's going to have some form of racism manifest in some kind of way, basically. And so rather than jump to defend yourself as a good person, people should be using the opportunity of being called out on a racist act to actually learn from it and then improve, rather than think that that means that someone is calling them a terrible person. And then she goes through different anecdotes of how she sees this happen in different workshops that she's had and things like that. Overall, I really found some of her definitions really useful. She describes things in good detail and follows with examples that really make her definitions and what she's saying very clear. I did think it got repetitive. Like, there are a few lists of things that come up over and over and over again, and that was not necessarily great for me. Like, I started to skim over those sections because it felt repetitive. That being said, it's really meant to be like an intro level book to anti-racism, right? You're going into this book and Robin DiAngelo is assuming that you don't really know anything at all. So she reiterates things because you might be learning them for the very first time. And for me, I think I had already read White Rage, so I was a little familiar with some of the terminology and ideas that she was going to use, but even so, I pick up on definitions fairly readily, so having them repeated over and over did not work well for me, but I can see the motivation behind it, like why it's necessary to repeat things over and over if you're writing a book for people that you assume are going to be seeing it for the first time. And so you just have to be patient with that. And if it's meant to be an educational resource, then sometimes you have to just reiterate things in different contexts until they start to stick. So I thought it was pretty good. A little long, like I said, because of the repetition than it might have been, even though it was still quite short, but a useful resource, and one that I think that I learned from. And again, I'm not rating it in my standard 5-star system because it's a nonfiction book and it just has completely different goals from the books that my main rating system typically applies to. So it just was what it was. All right, and then I have 2 books that are currently in progress in the month of June. The first is Season of Storms by Andrzej Sapkowski. This is the last Witcher prequel book that I'm reading with my boyfriend, and I don't know if we'll be able to finish it in June before July starts. It's currently June the 29th, so actually I know we won't be able to finish it before the end of tomorrow, but we should finish it this week. Like, we're gonna move. The first couple of days are going to be really hard, and then probably by the latter half of the week we'll be reading more again, and I think we'll finish it before the end of the week. So we're almost halfway through, I think. That's a work in progress. I will follow up on that when I finish it, probably in my July wrap up. And then the second book I'm currently reading is Bone Crier's Moon by Catherine Purdy. This is a book that I'm reading on my own, and it's about bone criers and how they help move souls, like help souls pass on to some kind of afterlife. And I haven't gotten very far into it. I'm within the first 50 pages or so, but I'm not certain that I won't finish it in the month of June. I'm not sure how much I'll get to read today, but I have a 6-hour drive ahead of me tomorrow where I will be only minimally useful because I'm still learning how to drive our regular car, and I 100% cannot touch the U-Haul truck. So I'm just gonna be sitting there for a lot of hours, and I think I'll be able to get through a good chunk of it. If not by the end of June, in the next day when we're driving the last half of our trip for another 5 hours, July 1st. So I think that book is going to be done soon. So that's how my reading shaped up for the month of June. I would really love to hear down in the comments below what you read in the month of June. Did you have a favorite book? I think my favorite book for the month, favorite is an interesting word. I think the most useful book I read was White Rage, but then I think the most fun book I read was A Court of Thorns and Roses, but then one of the most overall best books I read was probably The Shadow Rising. And then we've got almost all the books I read. So there's that. I read a total of 5 books, and of the books that I rated, the average star rating was 4.3. So it's a good reading month. And I'm looking forward to the next one. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.